What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of the Sheehan Show here on Sherdog.com. My name is Sean Sheehan, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today. I think for the first time. We definitely had one planned before and it fell through. Anyway, Andy Stevenson, one of the head honchos over in the Auld Triangle Podcast, one of the top guys covering Irish MMA for the last decade nearly now, I suppose, at this stage, because we have the big Cage Warriors Dublin card coming up this weekend with a lot of the top Irish prospects on. So who better to get on to talk about it? Andy, how are things? Are you good?
Jeez, that was some intro, Sean. Thank you very much for having me on. I think it is the debut on the Sheehan Show. We did a podcast not that long ago, but I think it was on the severe Patreon maybe or something like that. Yeah. But a pleasure to be on. Not quite a decade. You're aging me there now, but a pleasure to be on.
Do you know what? I think the last time we had one planned was maybe one of those cancelled cards that came up there at the end of maybe last year. So hopefully this one doesn't get cancelled. Although there's a few fights have kind of gone in and out in the last few days, but I'm sure we'll get into that. Let's get straight into it here, because a half an hour is probably about an hour too short to talk about this card, because it is absolutely stacked with Irish talent. And I suppose people listening to this worldwide, we can maybe pick out the best and the biggest and explain to you why they are the talent coming through. And let's start with the main event, and this James Sheehan fight, no relation, against Justin Burlinson for the Cage Warriors welterweight strap. I must say, before we get into James Sheehan, his Team Rhino, I was talking to your colleague Ian the other day over on the Severe MMA podcast, and we were discussing how Team Rhino, we all know like SPG was the top dog for many years, and felt like Team Rhino were the ones always challenging him, and didn't, a load more great gyms not just popped up, but came to the fore, like FAI especially, obviously. But Team Rhino, I don't know what you feel like, Andy, but I feel like they've had a real rejuvenation over the last while with the likes of James Sheehan, and we see Solomon Simon on this card as well, Jar Harris and many more. And obviously people will know him, if you listen to this in America, you'll know him from the likes of Paul Redmond and Neil Seery, who are top guys at the time, and Neil Seery obviously the great run in the UFC. But tell us about Team Rhino and James Sheehan in the main event here. It's a big moment for that gym again. Obviously they had won the belt with James Sheehan, but to go in there against Justin Burlinson in this big fight, Team Rhino is a gym back on the rise, I would say, again at the moment. Would you agree, Andy?
I would. There's a real groundswell at the moment for Team Rhino. Like I would say, when you, like, to your point, when you were thinking of them previously, you would think of Seery and of Redzer, and really there was a huge gap between them and the rest of the team, just based on experience, based on the level that they were fighting at, the opponents they were fighting, etc., and the age profile as well. And now we're seeing, a decade on, I suppose, from when the lads were in, or not quite a decade, but almost a decade, when they were in the UFC, and they've got this new era now, so that where you have the likes of, like, James Sheehan has essentially kind of assumed that Paul Redmond role within the gym as the team captain and is leading the charge there. But like, you look at a guy like Solomon King Simon, where we had him as our emerging Irish prospect of the year this year. He looks phenomenal, and he's a guy who kind of continues to rise to the occasion and to the challenge that's put in front of him each time, which is very exciting to see, because it's all well and good looking great against, whatever, an 0-5 opponent, or, a debuting pro. But when you go in against someone who's had, 20 odd pro fights and blow the doors off them, essentially, like that's a statement. So really excited to see him. Obviously they've had the likes of Jar Harris join the team. He was previously over under Owen Roddy, but he's been a Team Rhino now for a couple of years, and he's doing brilliantly there. He's putting a lot of work in with Neil Seery on the pads, etc. And then you've even got maybe kind of the younger crop who are breaking through, like the likes of Lewis Byrne, who's, he's not fighting on this card, but he's looking great. Jamie Abbott-Bissett, he's an Irish twin alongside his sister Nadine Abbott-Bissett. Jamie's fighting on this card. He looked brilliant in his debut there on the last Cage Warriors card. And yeah, this is, I suppose, they're building on the momentum that they were carrying in from the previous Cage Warriors Dublin card last year in the RDS, where they went undefeated. And again, and sorry, one more to call out from that gym is Adam Darby. Yes. Adam Darby is like, he's going to say 6'4", 6'5", welterweight. He's long, lanky, but my God, like he's dangerous anytime he throws. He's been training out over in San Diego with this MMA factory team that Graham Boylan and the guys there have kind of put together. and he looks phenomenal. Unfortunately, he didn't get to fight there on the last Cage Warriors Dublin show due to injury, but he's back now. He's looked phenomenal. He looks a real threat, and the frame that he has in the division that he's in is going to be a problem for anyone to handle. So very excited to see him back too.
I think just before we touch on the main event again, that Adam Darby fight against Tommy Ganglovsky, that's my undercard fight at night, because like Tommy Langowski's a guy that pops up to me every time I'm doing a PFL Europe card or, you know, a one championship card or something like that. He has fought so many guys that go on to be guys, like, and you might look at their names and you maybe not recognize them, but then, you know, I've watched him so many times and he's had some good fights himself as well. So that's a real test for Adam Darby. But we'll touch on the Team Rhino guys as we go down through the card here. But just to concentrate on Sheehan and Burlinson for a second, I think it's a very, very interesting fight, because like you have Burlinson, the guy who is a real warmonger. Like people, people probably seen Justin Burlinson around the world, but if you haven't, this is a guy who, you know, he puts it out there. Like his last 4 fights are 4 finishes. He's 3-1, 3 third round finishes, and 1 6 seconds left in the second round. And that tells you all you need to know about Justin Burlinson. He will just go at it and at it and at it and keep going. And, you know, his fights turn into bloody affairs. You know, maybe not the most technical guy in the world, but a very, very, very talented guy and a very tough guy. And then James Sheehan at the other side of it, like, he is a very, very technical guy, but can also get into those wars and has also won fights when he gets into those wars. My suggestion anyway, I know what you think, would be like that James Sheehan maybe fights that more technical game, tries to get at the end of that jab and tries to be, you know, the maybe the matador in here against Burlinson. But that's easier said than done, isn't it, against a guy like Burlinson who maybe wants to turn it into a war.
I was chatting with Ian Machado Gary there, and like he kind of described it as, and I said this in the Auld Triangle too, he was describing it as, it's like James Sheehan going in and fighting the English version of James Sheehan in this fight, where like you are like Burlinson, if you haven't seen him fight, go watch the fight that he had with Rhys McKee up in Belfast. Now Rhys ended up winning that fight, but Jesus Christ, it was a war. Rhys's face was an absolute mess by the end of the first round even, and Burlinson will be looking to make this a dogfight essentially on Saturday night. And James Sheehan is no stranger to a fight like that. We think all the way back to his fights with Ian Gary. We think, even his last fight against Daniel Conrad when he won the title, went 4 rounds with them. But I would 100% agree with you that, like, I think it's a technical fight he needs to fight here. Maybe even like in the opening round, lull Burlinson into a sense of, okay, here we're going to just kind of, get into a good old fashioned fist fight, a good old fashioned scrap here. But I think back to when he fought Jamie Richardson, and he fought very technically there, very tactically. And to be honest, he used his grappling. He took the fight to the ground. He had him, I remember, in this weird position where he kind of he controlled the wrist, but across Richardson's own face, and just bullied him and beat him up from there. So I could see a similar performance if things go to plan for James Sheehan on Saturday night, a similar performance to that where, you can test it out on the feet. But I wouldn't be just getting into a street fight for the sake of it with Justin Burlinson, because it's a very dangerous thing to do.
100%. And plus Justin Burlinson, he's also very good on the ground as well. Like, looking at his record there, it's funny you wouldn't think, but he has 7 submissions and he's 9 wins, and the other 2 are knockouts as well. But like, I think it's an interesting one as well. You mentioned some of their opponents, like Boda fought Jamie Richardson, but like, Rhys McKee, Daniel Skibinski, Johan Lanise for Burlinson. And then, as you mentioned as well, like Ian Gary, Matthew Bonner, the former champion, Oban Elliott, who we've seen now in the UFC, and a few more in there as well for James Sheehan. This is a high level fight in Cage Warriors, very, very high level. The one question I wanted to put to you, and maybe this is a question for afterwards, but where do you think James Sheehan is now? Like, if it felt like the last time when we watched the Hardwick brothers fight, especially Harry, because George had his opportunity to, like, he wins that, he's going to get a contender series shot, or he's going to get a shot in the UFC maybe. For James Sheehan, it feels like he's one of those lads that, a lot of lads now, they become champion and they're like, oh, immediately we think they're going to become a UFC guy or a contender series guy. And I don't know why that feeling wasn't around him, maybe because he had lost that fight to Oban Elliott. But if he goes 3-0 now in his last 3, after putting on a good fight with Oban Elliott, after putting on a good fight with Ian Gary, going to a decision with both of them, do you think the UFC could be around the corner here for James Sheehan? Could this fight mean that much?
I'd certainly hope it. I mean, even if he wins this, he'd be 3-0 in his last 3, obviously. But if you look back to like since he fought Ian Gary, he'd be 8-1 and he'd have 5 finishes. And like that's over a 5-year period, almost 6-year period now. So I think a finish would be very, very beneficial to him here. Just given the way that the UFC seem to operate these days. But like in another era, I suppose you'd be like, yeah, of course he's going to go to the UFC with a win here. Like that makes logical sense. But it's tough to know. But I do think he's in a really good spot in the sense that maybe it's not a direct to the UFC route, but if he goes in and finishes Burlinson on Saturday night, I don't see how the UFC wouldn't at the very least look at him for the Contender Series. Given that we're in April now, they'll typically start to be matchmaking for that probably in a month or so. They'll start to think about that, and then into the summer, that's when it'll get down to business there. So, but you'd kind of hope that maybe it'll depend on the shows that they've planned in Europe, because they'll typically kind of look for, like, that'll be maybe more so the entry route for him there. But like, God, like, I think I think if he can go in and show a finish here, and maybe not even a finish, but if he can go in and beat Justin Burlinson, to me, like, he's ready for the next step. And maybe, you could look a few fights back and say, okay, it'd be good for him to get a few more fights in the UFC or in Cage Wars, but he'll have done that now. He'll have fought for the title. He'll have gone, 3-round wars, 4-round winning the title, fighting Justin Burlinson, and in theory defending the title. I don't know what is much more left to prove. And then you look at his losses, and it's his pro debut against Matthew Bonner, who went on to win the Cage Wars title. It's Ian Gary. Look where he is in the UFC, and then Owen Elliott, who's on fire in the UFC at the moment as well. So like, I don't see how you could use that as a negative against him, albeit he doesn't have an undefeated record. But like, that's
100%.
The whole undefeated stuff is just unnecessary.
It is, and I think the fact that Burlinson has had that opportunity in the Contender Series as well, like, it'd be hard to deny James Sheehan that opportunity if he was to beat him. But having said that, I was going to ask you to give your pick, but we'll just be picking all the Irish lads here. So there's our picks for all the car. But like, Justin Burlinson is a live contender in this fight. There's no doubt about it, and he'll be looking for that opportunity in the UFC or the Contender Series as well. And if he can drag James Sheehan into a war, there's definitely a path to victory here. But I think, look, James it's a good stylistic matchup for James. That could turn very badly very, very quickly, but it's still good, I think. So, interesting one there. Let's talk about the co-main event. James Webb obviously taking on John Allan. Watching a bit of John Allan. Obviously, he's a big power puncher, good on the ground as well. 18 wins, 17 inside the distance. Coming in from outside of Cage Warriors. Obviously, having fought a couple of times in the UFC, and a couple of good guys in the UFC as well. Didn't have the best run in there, but this is the type of test James Webb needs, isn't it, Andy? Like, James Webb has been around for so long, and since moving up to light heavyweight, he's put on a serious amount of muscle, and he looks a different sort of fighter altogether. That win over Andy Clamp was absolutely unbelievable. Again, similar to James Sheehan, he's won his last 2. If he could go 3-0, this is a massive, massive fight for James Webb. And obviously, he's from England, but he's fighting out Team KF in Dublin under the tutelage of Chris Fields and Tom King over there. Big fight for James Webb, Andy.
Yeah, it's you know what, it's a weird one, because like it actually is a big fight for James Webb, and I hadn't, like, I'll put my hand up, I hadn't really thought of it as such until maybe a couple of weeks ago, when I'm like, you know what, a win here, and there's no reason why he couldn't be pushing to say, get me in the UFC now. What I kind of was saying to the lads and the Auld Triangles, I don't know if he's 35 now, so I don't know if that'll go against him in his age. But then again, you think about, like, he's fighting light heavyweight, so like they're always typically going to be older anyway. And like the way that he has rebounded, he was in a position where he came up through the Cage Warriors ranks. He was Team KF's first Cage Warriors champion and a real trailblazer for that gym. But then he ran into this is a very wrong way of describing someone, but my dad used to describe people as a brick shithouse, and like that's what he ran into in the likes of Matthias Frederick and Mick Stanton and these guys, and like those wars with Matthias Frederick, where he ended up losing the belt, and then he strings together a couple of wins, and then he suffers 2 really bad losses in the sense of emphatic KO losses to Matthew Bonner and Leon Aliu, and you're looking at him thinking, Jesus, where does he go from here? He has the fight with Paddy McCorry, who at the time was only 2-0. He was making his Cage Warriors debut, and again, like he got the win there, but Paddy McCorry had him in real danger, and then he gets knocked out by Mick Stanton for the title. And at that point, like the conversation is really like, should James Webb hang them up? Like that's the reality of it. Like where, like how much damage do you want to take for not that much money? But he said, no, fuck that. I'm going to go up a weight class. And he's looked phenomenal. I think he's looked the best and the most well-rounded than he has in his entire career since moving to light heavyweight. He's captured the title, and he's also putting a lot of work in with Tom Aspinall and that kind of team of big lads up, in the UK at the moment. So I think training with those guys when you're transitioning up to a new weight class can only help him, because he's not going to have, like, with the greatest respects to the lads in Team KF, those big type of bodies are not there. So I think that's probably important for him. So with a win here over John Allan, I mean, he'll be a 2-division Cage Warriors champion, having defended his belt if he wins on Saturday over a guy who's previously fought in the UFC. And again, like, well within his rights to say, what other challenges are really out there for me, and do any really make sense on the European scene anymore, or can you get me in there? And he's no stranger to a scrap, so I wouldn't see why the matchmakers would look at him. Like, he's not a boring fighter, but win or lose, he'll go out there and he'll scrap with someone, and it won't be a boring style. So yeah, very, very important fight for him on Saturday night.
When you threw that out there, are there any other challenges for him in the European series? I'm like, I can think of one. How about Will Fleury against James Webb for the... Ian Dean will be giving out to me for trying to steal away his fighters here for Octagon, but I wouldn't mind seeing that. But no, like, every fighter, every champion in the UFC at the moment is over 30. So, like, to your point, like, I think they need to kind of forget about this, we're not signing people over 30 malarkey, because, like, that's where they go. But anyway, we'll move on. One of his opponents we fought, Paddy McCorry. I think out of all the rest of the card, I think there's a lot of lads on the verge of maybe fighting for a Cage Warriors title, and you could argue Paddy McCorry is too. But I think Paddy is so talented, and he's obviously, the UFC know about him considering he was on Tough and everything like that. I would not all be surprised if he got the route to the Contender Series, because, again, middleweight, there aren't that many middleweights around. Big, strong, exciting, has a word to say about things too. Fighting out of the gym he's fighting out of. His opponent, watched a bit of him. Look, I think it's a good matchup for Paddy. I think he'll go in there and win it. But, I know you've spoken to Paddy a few times. He is definitely a name guy should be. Remember, like, he's 5-1, and the only guy he's lost to is James Webb, and he's second or third fight. And James Webb had been a champion and everything in division by then. That fight came too early for him, I think. I think if that fight happened now, it might be a little bit different, and maybe that's one we need to revisit as well. But Paddy, what do you think of Paddy McCorry? Like, people in America, people across the water should be keeping an eye on this guy, shouldn't they?
They absolutely should. There's 19 representatives of Irish MMA on this card, and if you take the title fights aside, I think that Paddy McCorry is probably the guy to watch on this card. I'd say him and Solomon Simon, if you're looking at two lads who are ready to kind of make that next jump. But I do think that Paddy McCorry is further along, as you said, in his career, or like kind of ready to make that jump, considering he fought on The Ultimate Fighter. Every single win that he's had has been a finish, and all but one have come in the first round. So, like, that kind of speaks to his potency. When you look at that last fight that he had with Ty Palmer, now, no, with the greatest respect to Ty Palmer, I didn't think he was on Paddy's level, but, like, you can go in and fight a guy who really shouldn't be in there with you, and you can beat him, or you can go in and show the reason why he shouldn't be in there with you. And Paddy went in there and showed the reason. Like, he looked flawless, and he looked just incredibly dangerous. And he is a guy who I think that the fans will connect with. He's a guy who's outspoken, who wears his heart in his sleeve. And additionally, there's a lot of momentum behind the lads up in Fight Academy Ireland at the moment with the rise of Paul Hughes. So, both, obviously that's in the PFL, but if you can get another lad fighting out of West Belfast who is a finisher and will ruffle many a feather if he gets into the UFC, I don't see why not, considering also the fight that he lost. He had one win, he had a finish on The Ultimate Fighter, and then he lost via armbar, but that one round fight was incredible. He almost had Valentin out there. He landed a beautiful knee in that fight, and I thought he gave a great account of himself. So again, he talked to us about needing maybe a couple more fights before he goes back there, but I think there's two options. If he wins on Saturday, you either look for the Contender Series, and if that's an option, go for it. Or if not, you got to start calling for that belt in Belfast, is my opinion. Like, he's a guy who could also headline a show for them if they need it up in Belfast.
No doubt about it. I think you spoke about Paddy being like the most interesting guy, I suppose, outside of the title fights. I think the most interesting fight outside of the title fights is Kenny Mokhonoana against Matthew Elliott, because there's so many storylines. This obviously Kenny Mokhonoana fighting in SPG, and we know, and if you don't know, there was a big rift between SPG and Cage Warriors, and we've both questioned Graham Boylan and John Cavan. I think the two of us have done it over the years, and it was always kind of like, oh, there's no rift. Oh, what's going on? And or maybe sometimes a few.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Remember John Cavan? I don't know. Was it to me or I think it was to you? He said it. You'd get paid more for stacking shelves in Tesco than you would for fighting in Cage Warriors or something like that. So, but it looks like the enemy lines have been crossed a little bit. There's a few more SPG fighters coming on the cards, and we have this one, and then we have Matthew Elliott, who is coming from FAI, and we all know, FAI and SPG aren't exactly the best of friends, and Matthew Elliott is again a guy who's very outspoken at times, and Kenny's kind of coming in here and is being outspoken as well and saying he's going to beat Matthew. I would put it to you, Andy, this is a very tough fight for Kenny, because his last two opponents have done to him what Matthew Elliott will probably want to do to him as well, and take him down and beat him that way. Although Matthew Elliott's striking has looked better recently as well. I think he's a smart guy, and I think that's probably what he'll be doing. But for Kenny, there's balls in him really to take this fight, because this is a fight he really shouldn't be taking. I don't think. I don't know who his management are or whatever, but if I was his manager, I wouldn't be advising him to take this fight. But that's me, and he's a fighter, and he goes in there, and maybe it's tough. And I know he's spoken before about it being tough to get opportunities, so maybe he has to take opportunities like this to get himself the next opportunity. But this is your real. What's the word I hate, Andy? What's the word I hate?
An Irish domestic matchup.
Domestic, yeah. But this is a real domestic brawl here, isn't it? I assume you're looking forward to this one as much as I am.
Yeah, I mean, I literally everything you just said there, I agree with, and as I said to the lads in the Auld Triangle, there's so many fighters on this card, and for people who are maybe unfamiliar with Irish MMA, there's guys on this card and girls, men and women who are just starting their pro careers, are undefeated, are looking phenomenal. The likes of Emer Darcy and Keith Keogh and Conor McCarthy and Max Lally and Kieran Brady and all these people who they're all bona fide prospects that are breaking through. And then you've got the lads, the likes of the Solomon Simons and the Paddy McCarrys, and then you've got the title fights up top. But my attention does keep coming back to this fight, because you just can't beat a bit of raw local rivalry and it's not even like bad blood, but they're kind of shit talking each other and they don't like each other, but it's not in a real toxic way. It's just kind of where fun. They're no, I'm gonna smash this lad, and well, they'll probably shake hands in the cage after. But I agree, it's a tough fight for Kenny to take, and I think it is. I like all the respect in the world for backing himself here, because he's coming off two losses where he lost to Josh O'Connor in Bellator, and then took ages to get it matched again, and he got caught up in kind of contractual stuff with Aries where they never even gave him a fight in the end, and he was waiting for so long for a fight, and then he gets matched with Ibrahim Ibrahimov, who's this out-and-out wrestler who ragdolled him, to be blunt, and now he's going in here against Matthew Elliott, who's competed for Team Great Britain in both judo and wrestling prior to entering MMA at the Commonwealth Games. So Matthew Elliott had, again, for people who may be unfamiliar with Irish MMA, he had another domestic showdown versus Ryan Shelley a few years back, and there was a big controversy over it, and essentially Matt lay on him for 3 rounds, and Ryan threw some shots from bottom. But since then, Elliott has learned from this, and he's getting submission wins in the last few fights, so he's dangerous on the ground now as well. So considering the way that Kenny has lost the last two, it's a very, very dangerous and risky fight for him to take. However, if he can go in here and get this done, it's a huge scalp to take, and I absolutely expect some brilliant atmosphere in the arena when it goes down, and it is brilliant that Kenny, along with the likes of Stephen Costello, etc., are SPG Ireland at the HQ fighters who are now signed to the promotion, and we're entering a new era where no longer is it just kind of this segregated, Bellator SPG shows and no one else. We're seeing SPG still on the PFL card up in Belfast in a few weeks, but now we're also on Cage Warriors. So it's great, it's brilliant, and fair play to everyone for making it happen, because it's been a long time coming.
As hugs and kisses all over Irish MMA now. So how long will that last? Let's see. You mentioned Ryan Shelley. His opponent, I don't think it's official yet. He was supposed to fight Albert Diaz, but he's another opponent coming in. Look, a massive fight for Ryan Shelley, coming off of a few losses, obviously. But like, such a talented guy, you'd hope he'd be able to bounce back. The same could be said for Ger Harris. Again, a similar thing. Ger Harris's opponent fell out and he's a new opponent. Literally, I think this has only been confirmed maybe since we came on. Marcus Vinicius Ferreira. There was talks of it yesterday, all right, but that's just been confirmed. An 8-2 guy. Watched a bit of him. Again, he looks a talented guy. So a big fight for Ger Harris. And I think on the main card as well, we mentioned Solomon Simon a few times, but Solomon must be on the verge of a title shot, I think, if he wins this, because he's only 5-0, but people might know about Solomon is he had about 1,000 amateur fights. I remember watching Solomon as an amateur years and years and years ago, and I'm glad I tweeted about it because it could make me look a genius in years to come. And he's looking very, very good. You know, him against Harry Hardwick, if Harry Hardwick was to stay, would be an interesting fight. But if Harry Hardwick gets an opportunity, maybe on the Contender Series, you could see Solomon, if he wins this, fighting for the vacant title, and he's fighting Christian Iorga here. I want to touch on a couple of more, lads. Tell us about the story about Alexander O'Sullivan. He was on with you, wasn't he, in the Auld Triangle? Ian was telling me about it. He had serious health issues over the last while, and that's why he hasn't fought in a while. Tell us about that, Andy.
Yeah, Jesus, poor Alexander O'Sullivan. He had a stroke, so he told us all about, went into all the details in it on the Auld Triangle, but like, he essentially was staring at a scenario where he thought that was it for him, that MMA was no more from a fighting perspective, and he was going to have to put, he essentially runs, it's a family run gym, but is, the head guy there over at CMAC MMA over in Mulhuddard near Blanchardstown. And so he was like, right, I'm just going to be a full-time coach. So I suppose the mental journey that he's had to go on since his last fight is considerable, where, you're only in your 20s. He's still a young guy, despite him I think he has the record for the most amount of amateur fights in the history of Irish MMA. Gary Rooney back in the day was like, I'm going for that. He never got there in the end. He transitioned to the pro ranks. But it's brilliant to see Alexander back, because he's a guy who's won medals all over the world at amateur, and he's looked great with, I think, back-to-back armbar submission finishes in his pro run to date. But yeah, it's going to be interesting just to see him back in the cage. He says that he's firing all cylinders again, like that he's been back. He was training, but he couldn't spar for a long time after the fact because, essentially it's a brain issue. But he's gotten the all clear. He's back now, but I'm butchering describing exactly kind of what he went through, but he did go into a shameless plug. Go and watch his interview with us on the Auld Triangle, because he went into great detail on it with us. But it's like, I don't know how someone can come back from a stroke and just train it, but then to come back and fight in a cage where you're taking punches to the head is I suppose admirable and also crazy. Yes. But he's a very, very talented fighter, and he's the main guy over at CMAC MMA, who are a gym that are starting to rise, and you're going to see a lot of amateurs transitioning into the pro ranks there.
His sister is a beast as well, Kaya, isn't she? She's after signing for, who'd she sign for, PFL?
Savage. PFL. Yeah. He was saying that they're aiming to get her into I would imagine, the PFL Europe tournament next year. So we'll probably see her maybe fight a few times, and then a similar route to the likes of Dakota and Chanel Dyer. So, but Jesus, yeah, Kaya O'Sullivan is a name to remember.
Yeah, Head Kick Central. When we're on women's MMA, Emer Darcy as well, 2-0 now. Emer's the type of one, I feel like if we did this podcast in 2 years' time, we could be talking about her as one of the top fighters at the card, because she's such a good athlete and very good. Kikyo as well, we were talking about amateurs with a lot of fights. He had a lot of amateur fights, and he was one of the Severe MMA Amateurs of the Year from a couple of years ago as well. So looking forward to seeing him. Kieran Brady as well, another guy. I know you've talked to him in the Auld Triangle. He's 3-0. But I want to finish up here by talking about look, if we're to talk about I would say the most hyped Irish MMA young prospects ever, maybe apart from Ian Gary. I think Ian Gary is probably the most hyped ever. Max Lally and Conor McCarthy, both guys 3-0 now. Conor McCarthy obviously coming in here to Cage Warriors again. Max Lally debuting in Cage Warriors after what feels like an age. I know both lads have been training together, obviously down in Peter Quealy's gym. Max Lally has been over training with Alexander Volkanovski as well, as he prepared for his fight there a couple of weeks ago. these lads, Jesus, and when you look at these lads, it's hard to pick out who's more talented. Peter Quealy's doing a fantastic job with him. The conditioning on him as well is always unbelievable. You probably see those Instagram messages as well where they're lying on the floor every week. Absolutely,
where they just look like they've just been abused or something.
Yeah, Peter Quealy's taking a bat to them. I think it's what happens. But geez, tell us about Conor McCarthy and Max Lally, because you couldn't overstate the quality in these two lads, and I think it'd be a shock to a lot of people if these two lads didn't either win Cage Warriors titles, go to the UFC, or both over the next few years.
Yeah, like when you think back to the kind of debates that we used to have around Ian Gary and Paul Hughes, that's kind of what it feels like with Conor McCarthy and Max Lally right now. Like, and it's kind of it's unfair to say because there's so many other prospects that are around there as well. But it's just we've kind of been comparing the two of them, or like their names have been in the same breath since their first amateur fights. Like we see fighters a lot more now when they're breaking onto the amateur scene, because there's much more of a scene now, and there's the likes of like the nationals and things like that. So we're seeing like guys like Conor McCarthy, who just continues to level up, and like who has had a pedigree of boxing from the very get-go that is just fantastic to watch. And now it's going to be very interesting to see, like we see them at the amateur stage, but like that's to like, without being harsh, that's not enough. Like they have to rise and they have to add tools to their kits as they go on and as they face stiffer competition. But we're starting to see them get those challenges now and to see how they fare. But yeah, like the two of them have absolutely bags of potential. Max Lally's been training since like day dot. He was over, I remember, as a young teenager going over to like the Danaher Death Squad to get jiu-jitsu training in. Obviously, as you mentioned, he's been out with Alexander Volkanovski. But I think for the two of them, they have tremendous skill in the cage. Like if you were to classify them, you would probably say Conor's more of a striker and Max is more of a grappler. But it's in particular when I speak with Max, it's his mindset that is just, it blows me away, because he just seems to have, and Conor too, really, they both have such good heads on their shoulders and are very, very self-aware and not kind of resting on their laurels and not focused just purely on ego. We asked Max yesterday who the best prospect in Irish MMA is right now, and any other fighter would immediately be like, oh, it's me.
Yeah.
And he was kind of like, with a bit of coaxing, he was like, oh, look, of course I back myself, but he didn't say himself. He said Solomon Simon. And I think having that kind of approach where he knows he's nowhere near the finished article yet can only serve him moving forward. So they're two lads who there's huge expectations on. Like we expect them, and it's probably unfair, we expect them to reach, Cage Warriors championship level and on to the UFC, but they're very early in their careers. So probably need to give them a little bit of bandwidth to continue to develop and maybe take a loss and maybe come up against a competitor who outmatches them and then to rebuild, etc. But there's a lot of promise in those two young lads.
And you make a great point about expectation, because expectation is almost worse than people, maybe not people going against you, but people like saying, oh, they're a bit green, or need a bit of work. Say like a Jar Harris now. Like you look at Jar Harris's couple of fights and the one he lost last time, you're like, right, there's clear places where he needs to improve. Like some fighters might listen to us talking about that or watch back their fights, and it'll really help them and bring them up. Whereas if you're only talking good about people and saying, oh, he's going to get to the UFC and all, there's a tendency as well, maybe it could soften you a tad. And that's a tough thing to get over. It really is a tough thing to get over. So I think, Conor McCarthy and Max Lally probably have to work a bit at that too, to I suppose stave that off. But Jesus, they're unbelievable process. We'll keep talking them up, Andy, anyway.
Yeah, 100%. And like, just like as you've said many, many times, and the lads were kind of saying it there when I was chatting to them yesterday, is like they're in such a good spot here with Ian Dean, because it's that type of matchmaker that will help you develop. And they're kind of like uncut gems at the moment, and they'll be polished into diamonds over time. But that does take time, and it's I certainly have the habit of being like, anytime I see even an amateur fighter at this point, I'm like, he's going to be UFC world champion. Like, book it, send out the tweet.
God, I remember I was talking about Sean Clancy Jr. the other day, and I'm like, this lad, he could be a UFC champion, but he needs a bit of, he needs a bit of work. And I could just feel like the messages coming to me were like, what are you saying? I think this guy could be the world champion now, because there's a tendency for that to happen as well. But look, these things happen to me. Andy, The last two fights we haven't mentioned, Scott Harvey and Leon Armas, which was actually a good enough matchup, 4-0 against 3-0. And the other one we didn't mention was Jason Blair, who's been on a great run over the last while, obviously training with Paddy Pimblett and everything like that. He's a guy Cage Warriors think a lot of, I know, and to have him on this card is very, very good as well. So it's not just the Irish, mostly the Irish, but those are two fights to look forward to as well. But I suppose the headline, James Sheehan looking to defend his title again in his toughest matchup to date, maybe since he won the title against Justin Burlinson. We will be tuned in on Saturday. I know you're going to be there covering the card, so if you're not following Andy, please do. And if you're not listening to Auld Triangle Irish MMA podcast, also please do. You'll find it on YouTube and all your podcast apps as well. Andy, thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Won't be the last time. God bless.
Absolute pleasure.
God bless.